Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, February 16th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 Montana Senate race between Senator Jon Tester, the incumbent Democrat who was first elected in this seat in 2006, actually re-elected in 2012 and 2018, against Tim Sheehy, who is an unelected Republican who has been very popular amongst the core conservative base, whether it comes down to the mainstream GOP media, whether it comes down to the mainstream GOP senators. All around you are seeing that they really coalesced around one candidate, and thus these primaries are practically said and done for. And I know we talked a lot about Montana because there was a lot of consideration that Montana could be in a very, very difficult position because of where the Senate race was on the GOP side. Matt Rosendale, the incumbent representative from Montana's 2nd or 1st district, one of the two, who previously served in the Montana at-large district, was considering that he might run for this Senate seat. Now, this terrified Republicans, and honestly, for good reason, because Matt Rosendale's name might ring a bell, because in 2018, he actually ran for this Senate seat and lost to Jon Tester. Now, Matt Rosendale did eventually announce his bid for the Senate seat here. He was polling as the frontrunner very early on, but then came in Trump's endorsement, and then he decided to drop out of the race. So in less than a week of him even announcing his Senate bid in 2024, after Trump endorsed on the same exact day his direct opponent here, even though Donald Trump backed Matt Rosendale in 2018 and propelled him to win this nomination, he realized that, this was not the most electable choice, and so Donald Trump followed suit and decided to back out of endorsing him and endorsed Tim Sheehy altogether. And so this endorsement, coupled with the fact that the polls were no longer moving too well in favor of Matt Rosendale, he decided that he was going to drop out of the Senate race and has left his House seat practically open. The Speaker, or the Majority Leader of the Montana House of Representatives, decided that he's going to be running for this House seat. That was a very early indication that he had told many of his top colleagues and fellow Republicans in the state that he was intending to run for Senate. And so a lot of people saw that as he was going to be in this race no matter what. We quickly found out that that simply was not true, and he may not even return to Congress after this failed Senate bid that lasted less than a week. But then came in some bad news today for Republicans. A new Survey USA poll from the state of Montana, done with a local and very reputable news source in the state, found that Jon Tester leads the Republican frontrunner here, Tim Sheehy, by a margin of 9 points across the state. Now, the only other poll that had been actually done between Sheehy and Tester was one from Emerson College that showed Jon Tester with a 4-point advantage over Tim Sheehy. But a considerable portion of the state was largely undecided. And the reason why this race is also just so exceptionally competitive is because this is a state that Donald Trump won in the last election by a margin of around 20 points. When you see the margin here, 16 in favor of Donald Trump in 2016, he won the state by 21%. This is a solid red state. Montana hasn't voted blue since 1992, and you find that even then, went to Bill Clinton because of a three-way race, not because this state was at all Democratic, but it has a unique history of electing Democrats to the Senate, to the governorship, to the House of Representatives, and you might find that they could very well do this again in 2024. But looking at our Senate map here, Democrats are defending a lot of territory. West Virginia already is going to the GOP, and Democrats have competitive races all across the country, from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and of course, Montana. Republicans are really only defending the state of Texas as a competitive state, meaning that they have around 49 safe states for the GOP, and Democrats have just 43. But these new numbers, this 8-9 point advantage that we're seeing for Jon Tester in the state, is one that I think Democrats should be excited about. Because although they should not get complacent or at all assume that Montana is going to be a state where they're going to have a solid victory in, it comes at a very, very good time after a victory in the New York special election and after the announcement that Matt Rosendale was going to withdraw from the race. Now, even in the poll that showed Matt Rosendale against Jon Tester, the margin was actually the exact same. Another thing that should really worry Republicans, because the big argument here was that Matt Rosendale was significantly less electable than Tim Sheehy, which caused so many Republicans to back Sheehy in the first place and really bring him to the mainstream front. Besides Donald Trump's endorsement, before Trump had even spoken on this race, Tim Sheehy received endorsements from multiple U.S. senators, including his counterpart within the state, Greg Gianforte, the governor of the state, Steve Daines. That was the other person Matt Rosendale was hoping to serve with here, and that simply didn't happen, despite him being in the House clearly not the best relationship if he's endorsing Tim Sheehy, but it wasn't just him. The party fell in line largely around one candidate who they genuinely believed was going to be the strongest candidate in this race. Greg Gianforte, Doug Burgum, Kristi Noem, all surrounding states too in the state of Montana, people who have a strong reputation and a strong ability to have some type of weight on this race and move it in one direction. Matt Rosendale, who did drop out of the race, didn't receive any major endorsements. When he announced, he didn't get anybody picked up, and his only notable endorsements were Matt Gaetz, Mike Lee, Steve Bannon, and that was it. The president of the Montana Senate, though, and the speaker of the Montana House of Representatives, as Matt Rosendale had a very strong relationship with state legislators prior to, had also endorsed him in this race. But again, it wasn't enough to counteract the very clear endorsement advantage that Tim Sheehy had built up because he was perceived as the most electable. And so Matt Rosendale's lead in the primary that was set back in June, and honestly, Matt Rosendale, if he wanted the Senate seat, should have ran for it way back then when Donald Trump probably would have endorsed him in the race. Not happening now, and obviously it didn't happen. He's out of the race. But you found here that lead from 64 to 10 narrowed up to 52 to 21 to 41 to 44, with Tim Sheehy taking the lead after he's getting all these Fox News, Showtime coverage. And also you find that all the endorsements really came in around this time. Tim Sheehy with a 3-point advantage in the same poll in a three-way race, and then a one-on-one race from Coefficient in November showed that Tim Sheehy was defeating Matt Rosendale, but a huge chunk undecided. But again, the purpose of Tim Sheehy winning this race, receiving the endorsements, being backed by the National Republican Party, was because he was supposed to be more electable. Why? Because Matt Rosendale had ran and lost. But when you take a look at some of the data that we were working with, for instance, polls done just, a few months ago, ones done by JL Partners even, done back in August, showed Matt Rosendale with a 3-point lead over Jon Tester. Tim Sheehy had a 4-point lead. On Message showed Matt Rosendale with a 5-point lead over Jon Tester. There was no poll here that was equivalent for Tim Sheehy, but certainly very interesting. And now that we're seeing Jon Tester at the same exact point against Matt Rosendale and Tim Sheehy, because we really didn't see much of a difference then, it's really hard to see why they built this idea that he would be more electable, except for the fact that they had already tried this candidate. I think that is the only real reason you see Matt Rosendale really shoved to the side here by the mainstream GOP, because they simply didn't want to run the risk of losing again. But they very well might, and these numbers suggest that if they hold true, that Jon Tester wins the state by a likely margin. And if Montana is going blue by a likely margin, forget the Republican Party's hopes of winning a number of United States Senate races. If Biden wins the presidency, they have the majority. Ohio seems to be a state that is exceptionally competitive, but if Montana's going blue, chances are Ohio is too. Not to mention that Texas would still be up for grabs, but Ted Cruz is likely to win that one. And so we come to a point where, again, if Montana goes by the poll's expectation, the polling's predicted margin, we get to a point where Republicans now have lost a lot more hope about any chances of winning Senate control. But that's not where we are, because I don't trust this poll to be just the only thing in the state that seems to be telling us that it's going to go blue. I do think that Jon Tester is in a strong position in Montana. I equally think that Donald Trump is in a strong position in Montana. When you take a look at the 2020 presidential race, despite Donald Trump seeing, a significant movement in many other states, Montana just simply was not one of them. It was around a 4 to 5 point shift, which makes sense. But when you look at some bigger states, especially swing states, for instance, you have states like Arizona, which swung by a similar amount, but in a very, very different direction, all the way over into crossing into Biden territory. You found states like Colorado that shifted from being Clinton plus 4.9 to Biden plus 13.5. Very big advancements in favor of one party. And although the margin here of 4 to 5 points might make sense, Montana is a state where Democrats have had surprisingly a lot of luck and a lot of, hope in terms of how they're going to win. In 2022, we can find in the House race here in Montana that one of the districts actually almost went blue, which was quite interesting. Ryan Zinke won here by around 3 points in a district that should have been drawn pretty solidly for Republicans. Matt Rosendale, of course, on his side, got around 57% of the vote. This district really isn't competitive. The reason why his margin was so, it was very large, 35 points, but the reason why his vote share was lower than expected was because there was an independent who was running relatively on the right side of the aisle, but still got a considerable portion of the vote here. Democrats also ran a candidate. You're really talking about one of the more pro-Trump, pro-right-wing districts than you really see across the country. But Matt Rosendale did underperform, and I think that's also something that fueled into the reason why he was not going to be chosen for the Senate race here. But I think fundamentally, Montana has just had such an interesting history when it comes down to competitive elections. In 2018, it went to Greg Gianforte by 4.6, and Montana's at large. In 2020, it went to Matt Rosendale by 12.8. And so you keep in mind, too, that, again, Trump's winning these states, and this district, at the time, one district, now two districts, by 16 points, by 21 points. And to see it narrow down quite significantly tells us that Montana is not entirely against voting for someone like Jon Tester, because they have also done it in 3 elections consecutively, 3 consecutive Senate elections. And so I will say, Jon Tester is at a strong point because he is a liked and respected incumbent, but no other Democrat could really be doing this. This result from Survey USA, which typically actually finds itself to be a very accurate pollster, especially in this region of the United States, I was shocked because I was being fed this idea that Tim Sheehy was this unstoppable Republican opponent who was going to come into this as the immediate favorite for the Senate race. And yet the first piece of data where we find a race where the other candidate, Matt Rosendale, either was at the time not in the race or floated not being in the race and now was eventually dropped out of the race. And that gives us numbers where we can use them as a point of comparison between Matt Rosendale and Tim Sheehy. But now that we know it's going to be Tim Sheehy, I think Democrats are equally as happy as they were under Matt Rosendale. Now, I will say, Tim Sheehy certainly has time to catch up. The lead that he is down by is not what's going to happen on Election Day. Jon Tester just simply is a lot closer to 50% than Republicans are, because this electorate here that chooses Tester by 9 points still chooses Trump. This electorate that chooses Tester by 9 points still would choose a Republican that isn't, Tim Sheehy, or honestly just would choose a Republican if Jon Tester was not the Democratic opponent. Montana is narrow because voters like and respect Jon Tester. And they elected him first in 2006. We can take a look at his first election. It was not super competitive, but still, he has ran in very competitive races. Actually, it was. It was a little bit less competitive, I believe, in 12. It was around a 3.7% margin. Then in 2018, it was 4 points, so a similar margin, but 2006 actually was the closest one. He has won in competitive elections before. I mean, this guy knows what he's doing in the state. And keep in mind, Montana in 2012, if you want to take a look at the margin there, wasn't, Trump margins, but Mitt Romney still won across the state by around 14 points. And so for Jon Tester to have won by 4 means that he can swing an electorate by around 18 percentage points, swing it in favor of the Democratic Party. And if he does that again in 2024, based on his 2020 margin for Donald Trump, he could still theoretically win this Senate race. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing too, is that Tim Sheehy's lack of name ID and lack of recognition as a prominent and strong Republican does put him at a disadvantage. It means that he's going to be winning over a considerable chunk of these independent voters, whereas Jon Tester really only needs around 10 to 20% of the remaining undecided column to win. Tim Sheehy nearly needs 100% of that column. And so when I see that, I sort of come to a point where I wouldn't bank on Tim Sheehy being this automatic victor in the state of Montana. It really has put a halt in the way that I've addressed these Senate races. I think I've looked at them from such a different lens. Okay, Republicans get West Virginia, Montana goes next, then goes Ohio, and now it's a question, do Democrats maintain everything else? Now there might be some real possibility that our question here is Ohio now the most competitive Senate race? Is Montana going to go blue by 4 points like it did back in 2018, like in 2012, or go to the Democrats entirely like it did in both of those elections, or even 2006? I mean, Montana is a state, sure, that is Republican, but to an extent, and very willing to believe in the idea of civil liberties, especially in the policies related to abortion, especially in the policies related to what Jon Tester stands for. And get this too, Democrats aren't exactly upset with Jon Tester the way they are upset with Kyrsten Sinema. Although Jon Tester represents a state similar like West Virginia and not similar at all to Arizona, but he could be voting the way Kyrsten Sinema does, you find that he votes with the party line nearly 100% of the time. He's not one of those senators who holds out or builds up this guise in Washington, D.C. that he's bipartisan. He goes back home and does that effectively, and somehow it almost every single time seems to work in this state. This will be the true test, though. If we can see national partisanship, shift across the state of Montana to a point where they're voting very differently in the presidential than the Senate race, I will be thoroughly impressed. These numbers here are absolutely impressive, and they tell me a piece of the story that I wasn't getting from the mainstream narrative or what the pundits were saying out of the state of Montana. I wasn't getting that Jon Tester could have a very, very, very conceivable pathway to victory without Matt Rosendale being the nominee. I think it was everybody talking about how, it's over for Jon Tester now that Tim Sheehy's guaranteed to be the nominee. Matt Rosendale needed to be the nominee for this race to be competitive. It might have made it easier, but it certainly does not seem necessary at this point. And I think Democrats should take some solace in that, and knowing that Montana, realistically speaking, could be one of those states where they do win by a considerable margin, even if they weren't expecting to from the beginning. So keep your eyes out for new polls and new data out of the state of Montana. It certainly is going to be an exceptional point of interest for this election season. I think Republicans might be thinking about this and saying, where did we go wrong? What is Jon Tester doing right? But there's a lot of time between now and November 5th. And I think as we get closer and closer to that, we will have more and more data. But as of right now, Democrats are off to a strong, surging start relative to the last numbers back in October, and ones that I think should worry Republicans from this point onward and mean that $50 million that they spent and are spending in Montana needs to be doubled or tripled if they really want to crack down on this 9-point advantage that Jon Tester presently has. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.